This episode is brought to you by IT Revolution, whose mission is to help technology leaders succeed through publishing and events. You're listening to the Idealcast with Jane Kim, brought to you by IT Revolution. In this episode of the Idealcast, I'm so delighted to have on David Silverman and Jessica Reif. David Silverman is a co-author of Team of Teams and is founder and CEO of Crosslead. Dave spent 13 years as a U.S. Navy SEAL, leaving as a lieutenant commander, having received 3 Bronze Stars and other commendations. Later, Dave worked with his colleagues to codify and write down some of their amazing lessons learned to future leaders as part of that journey. Dave co-founded the McChrystal Group, where he served as their CEO for 5 years. I am such a huge fan of this book, which describes how, in 2004, the Joint Special Forces Task Force in Iraq was failing to achieve their mission to dismantle al-Qaeda in Iraq and what they did about it. Their work led to not only them achieving the strategic objectives, but also led to a deep and critical rethinking of almost everything across all U.S. military services and in commercial industry as well. Also with me is Jessica Reif, the Director of Research and Development for Crosslead, where she continues her work researching and codifying practices into the Crosslead management framework. She currently leads their education efforts, which have been delivered to over 20,000 leaders. I am so delighted that, like so many of us, she comes from a software background. She was previously Product Delivery Manager for applied machine learning and engineering teams at Oracle Data Cloud, where she had to solve the Team of Teams challenges in a software development and delivery context. In this episode, I was so honored to be able to learn more about the philosophies and thinking that went into Team of Teams, one of my favorite books I've read in the last decade. I learned about the truly breathtaking scale of the organization and management required to support hundreds of thousands of personnel involved in these operations and how it impeded the achievement of their portions of the mission. I learned about just how dramatic the changes were in the transformation described in the book. It is utterly amazing to hear about how and why it worked and being able to piece together the structure and dynamics both before and after the transformation. They talk about the leadership characteristics that are needed in this new way of working. I learned more about the famous Ops Intelligence Update call, the famous 90-minute call that happened daily involving 3,000 people around the globe, 365 days a year, and what was required to increase the tempo of operations by over 2 orders of magnitude, enabled by breaking some pretty amazing constraints. And as a side note, it is amazing to hear Dave describe the events that I read about in the book, often with a sense of wonder, even 10 years later. This is part 1 of a 2-part interview. You may notice that I asked Dave a lot of questions in the beginning to help set the stage and educate us on what the context of the book was. You will hear a lot more from Jessica at the end and in part 2 of this interview. Dave and Jessica, I'm so happy that you're both here. You both know how much I admire the Team of Teams book. It's been a topic of discussion in almost every one of these podcasts, but also within the broader DevOps enterprise community as well. So could you both describe yourselves in your own words and tell us about your involvement in the development of this amazing book?
I'm super excited to be talking to your listeners today about this journey. A little bit of background on me. So I grew up in a military brat, really moving around because my father was in the United States Navy as an aviator. He had served in Vietnam, and we moved around a lot as kids. And eventually, I found myself at the Naval Academy trying to continue that legacy of service. And I really wanted to be a part of a high-performing team because growing up, that's always where my passion was in sports, specifically water sports. And so I was fortunate enough to get selected and picked to become a Navy SEAL. And I graduated at this sort of interesting time in the history of the recent history of the United States, which is, we'd been in a prolonged period of peace and prosperity relative to the military services, in the late 90s and early 2000s. And then after my first deployment, we came back and everything changed. 9/11 had happened. And for the next, still going on today, really, but for me, the next 10 years, it was effectively just a nonstop series of operational deployments around the world trying to combat this threat of terrorism that had been manifesting for, a while beforehand. And so during that journey, me and a lot of peers who kind of went through this crucible of being very junior officers in the military and then sort of being baptized and brought up in this new conflict had to go through rapid change and iteration. And we felt like that experience was pretty transformational. But two, our assumptions were that it wasn't unique to the military, that some of the lessons that we were learning on the battlefield were going to be applicable to broader society and industry at large. And so that a group of us got together, started a company to try to translate those experiences into services, and then ultimately try to codify that experience in the book, Team of Teams.
Awesome. And Jessica, how did you get involved in this amazing effort?
Gene, thanks so much for having us. I'm a huge fan of the Idealcast and really excited to be here today as well. So I've been working with Crosslead for the better part of 7 years in one capacity or another. Like you said, I'm part of the research and development org now. I wasn't directly involved with the writing of the book Team of Teams, and it was actually well underway by the time I met Dave. But after the book was published, there has been a lot of interest from enterprises that really understood that they could benefit from applying our firm's methodology, Crosslead, which is a set of practices that reinforces the concepts of common purpose, shared consciousness, empowerment, and trust within organizations. So this is really the area that I'm really passionate about. And my primary role has been to develop research-based training programs and practices that help teams work together more effectively in complex environments, particularly when they have to continuously adapt to change.
This is so great. I've been waiting so long to interview both of you. So Dave, you talked about your desire to go back and start writing things down. Could you talk about what the motivation for that was? If I understand correctly, you were trying to teach other junior officers in the U.S. Navy. What were the goals of that? Were you trying to teach? What did you teach them? And why do you think those teachings were missing?
Yeah, so let me go back a little bit. So to frame what's going on here, it's 2001. I get back from deployment in August from a tour to the Pacific, where primarily our mission was to engage and train in mutual bilateral relationships with allies to help them as they, sort of advance or professionalize their respective militaries. We come home, I go out to the East Coast with my, at the time, girlfriend to meet her family and friends, and then fly back on September 10th of 2001 on the flight that the next day crashed into the South Tower of the World Trade Center. And so I get a frantic phone call at 6 a.m. in the morning from her father, who believes we're on that flight, panic saying, where, are you guys okay? Where are you guys? And that was the start of a pretty, crazy time. So fast forward, the invasion of Iraq has occurred. I've come back from being a part of that experience, and it's now about 6 or 7 months later. I'm sitting in a friend's living room, my best friend, my roommate from college, and one of his mentors and Naval Academy graduates as well, who is a Marine. And this guy's name was Doug Zimbeck. And he asked this profound question in this room. And, to understand that scenario, when you train to go to war, you have this preconceived notion of what it's going to be like. And so really what this conversation was trying to sort of, unpack and unwind what the actual experience was. And we'd had 3 very different experiences. In the case of Doug, he had just come out of the first Battle of Fallujah, where his unit had taken 70% casualties. And it was, obviously a very intense and life-changing experience for him. And he made this statement. He said, look, every generation in the United States history has served during times of need. And they go overseas, they do things, they learn, and they bring those experiences back to society to try to improve it. I believe fundamentally that this war is going to be different than other wars. I think it's going to be a prolonged fight. I think the percentage of the population that's going to be engaged in it actively is going to be very small, because I don't anticipate there being a draft. So it's going to be incumbent upon people like us to capture those experiences and translate them back into society and make it better. I was 25 at the time. I was like, that's heady stuff in the conversation. But that was the initial seed for what would later become Crosslead in the book Team of Teams. And so fast forward, it's now 4 or 5 years later. we've now done multiple deployments to various combat zones around the world, all of us. And I get a phone call as I'm walking through the United States Senate offices where I'm told that Doug Zimbex was just killed in Iraq. And it was, here was a good friend of mine, a guy that was in my wedding. Obviously, he was a larger than life figure that had a profound impact on a lot of people. But we came out of that experience. I would go back to Afghanistan, and when I came home,
what year is that at this point?
This is now like 2009, 2010 timeframe when we got back from Afghanistan. Doug would die in 2007, and we said, "Hey, look, let's take this thesis that Doug had and see if we can't live up to this legacy of service and try to give back in some meaningful way." And the experience that we had overseas during that 10-year period, and to be fair, it's still going on today, was pretty transformational, right? We came from this legacy training and development program in the SEAL teams, which was, I would say, tied to industrial warfare best practices. And what we had transformed into was something much more akin to an agile leadership and management best practices. We didn't call it those terms because to be honest with you, I didn't even know what agile meant. But what it meant was this idea that you were part of a larger task force that was tightly coupled with a lot of interdependencies, and we had to rapidly disseminate and learn effectively in real time so that then we could apply those lessons locally to make faster, better decisions to combat our threat. And the enemy at the time was leveraging significant advancements in technology for them to disseminate learnings, while we were still initially passing up key lessons through a very hierarchical bureaucratic information flow. And so we were at a significant disadvantage, and that disadvantage is where, on an aggregate level, we found ourselves losing. And so when we made this pivot to operating much more analogous to what I would say agile principles and values, all of a sudden, we rapidly increased our rate of learning, which then allowed us to bring to bear all of our competitive advantages associated with technology, talent, and training to basically combat and sort of suppress this immediate threat of violent radical extremism that was manifesting in the areas that we were operating in. So those lessons, our thesis was, were not unique to the military. The fact, the larger change that was happening in the environment was this advancement of how people fundamentally communicate and collaborate and learn that was being enabled by mobile and social technology and media. And that if you could get organizations to think fundamentally differently about that, they could also have decisive effects on how fast they could adapt their operating practices to be competitive in an environment that was increasingly more complex or changing very rapidly.
This is amazing, and I have goosebumps for so many reasons. If I understand correctly, one of your immediate goals was to teach fellow junior officers. Could you talk about what you taught and who you were teaching, and maybe how receptive they were to being taught?
Well, I would say while we were part of this task force, the immediate goal was to disseminate learnings across the mid-level ranks of the organization as quickly as possible so that they could apply those lessons locally. So in that sense, yes, we were trying to teach the senior NCOs, non-commissioned officers, and the frontline managers and leaders what was happening and how they could apply those locally at the same pace that they were changing. When we came and got out, our initial thesis was we were going to focus this predominantly on, one, validating that this hypothesis was correct. And our goal was to try to do that in industry, because our thesis was industry had quantifiable metrics that would judge operational performance that we could attach this framework to, and we could demonstrate results. And if we could demonstrate results, then we could take it back and try to address larger social opportunities and issues like COVID-19. I mean, which I think is a perfect example of how the globe has been mobilized and should be thinking of itself as a team of teams, and how they're trying to rapidly learn from each other on best therapeutics or best treatments or best vaccines that could be then rapidly disseminated to, hopefully save lives and restore, the economy back to safety again.
Oh, right on. And by the way, I believe so wholeheartedly in your thesis. So that initial teaching was really for the team of teams in the context of Iraq, later Afghanistan, the people who were embedded in these missions that were mutually dependent to achieve the goals.
So to answer that more broadly, the original task force had a global mandate, but it was concentrated predominantly in those two areas that you talked about, Iraq and Afghanistan. But very quickly, what we realized was that those two theaters of operation we're highly connected, both from us, our allies, and also our adversary, with the rest of the geography. So in this case, the Maghreb and the Levant and other parts of the Arabian Peninsula were feeding funding, talent, resources into those AOs. And so if you're trying to go upstream from the problem and try to address it on multiple different areas, you needed to have a broader coalition that was mobilized around the problem set. And so what initially was what we thought was decoupled, like what happens in Algeria is really irrelevant to what's happening on a daily basis in Baghdad, became actually highly connected when you start to realize that maybe there was a madras that was radicalizing and then sending through these what we called rat lines, talent and money all the way that was then ending up on the battlefield in Baghdad. So how do I get the people that are trying to solve that problem in Algeria on board and understanding the problem that we're seeing here, so that they can take that out of context and figure out how to apply it locally? So that was the intent of the original process changes that we made, was to say, this is the solution here is part of a larger network of organizations, countries, and that need to be mobilized around this problem set if we're going to solve it. No one person has the piece of the puzzle, but if we can put all the pieces on the thing, we could probably start figuring out what this thing actually looks like. And then once we're aligned on what it looks like, then we can start to operate much faster, more effectively locally to solve the problem.
This is so terrific. So one of the things that I've been so looking forward to is just really trying to understand the team of team story through the lens of structure and dynamics. And so you may or may not know, I've been spending this whole year really trying to view the world through how Steve Spear views the world, through three simple things. The notion of dominant architecture. In other words, there's a way of doing things that is very dependable, but very resistant to change. Then any system of work is really made up of two things: structure and dynamics. So structure is the way that we organize teams and the ways that the teams interface with each other. So it's most probably obviously manifested through the org chart, but also things that maybe aren't visible, which is the way that teams are allowed or incentivized to talk to each other or not. And then there's dynamics, which is almost wholly a function of structure. So the dynamics are about feedback, how quickly we get feedback. It's about the ways that signals are either amplified or extinguished. So when we have a culture that people are afraid to tell bad news, important signals might get lost entirely. Whereas if we are trying to elevate weak signals can be spread throughout the system far faster than it could through any sort of centralized command and control system. Could you tell us about how was your Iraq experience relative to General Stanley McChrystal? In the book Team Teams, McChrystal said he wanted a different approach. What were the visible things that he did and enacted? What were the resulting challenges that he tasked his leadership, and how did that cascade down to you? And Jess, I'm dying to hear also your reflections as an outside observer in terms of how you interpret this.
Yeah, it's a big question, and there's probably not going to be an answer that satisfies it complete. But maybe to give some context here, if you think of bureaucratic structures, org charts, I think the U.S. military sort of mastered how to make that as painful and as rigid as possible, right? So, and some of that's out of necessity because of the complexity of the operations and the pure scope of how they're trying to perform. So, if you go back to something like an invasion of Iraq, you have a geographic combatant commander who's responsible for a geography that is a 4-star either general or admiral. And they have a mandate to basically operationally manage, control, fight forces that are deployed to it from, in this case, the Joint Staff, which is the higher headquarters at the Pentagon, which takes assets from the different services and says, these assets are yours to use within these constraints for this period of time. And now when a war happens, there's a further subsetting that takes place, means there's now, in this case, a 4-star commander put in charge of the operation in Iraq. He has or she has unique authorities and permissions associated with that theater. And then inside of it, you'll have a combination of conventional forces, coalition forces, special operations forces, and then a whole host of other government organizations. Could be intelligence apparatus, it could be non-government organizations, you name it. So the hardest thing when you first get on the ground, especially if you're a relatively junior officer like myself, was just figuring out where you fit in. You're like, I don't even know, like, can somebody show me an org chart on where I fit in? So I understand, where are my operating sort of boundaries and permissions, and who do I need to keep informed? And it's highly matrix and very complex. And I would say, so we spend a lot of time just trying to sort through all that. And if you're relatively junior, you almost need like a experienced PhD to figure out how to map the whole thing out in complex. So when we got there, this wasn't unique. And traditionally what happens is, if it's predominantly a military operation, there's a military leader who has a civilian counterpart, and they two work in parallel to try to prosecute the goals and objectives of the coalition, and in this case, United States. And special operations would be one of the tools that they're given. Now, in the special operations community, we had different types of special operations units. We had sort of high-end counterterrorism, strategic assets, which in this case was being led and managed by the Joint Special Operations Command, of which General McChrystal was the leader for more than 5 years. And then you had conventional special operations forces, which are usually designed to work, train, advise, and equip and help fight alongside coalition assets. And everything in between, to be honest with you. I mean, even to try to explain the Special Operations Committee, it's a pretty diverse group. So what we realized pretty quickly was you have all these individual tribes, per se, operating in this common battle space, and somewhere, somehow, it's loosely connected. But for the most part, their cultures, their processes, their decision-making rights were all pretty siloed off, pretty isolated from each other. And what we realized, this wasn't going to work. We couldn't piecemeal a solution to this level of complexity. It needed to be something that could be much more organic in sort of how it operated and grew. And so very quickly, when you get close to a problem, you sort of naturally figure this out, right? So if you put a junior person from 4 different organizations in the same physical location and you give them a similar mandate to, say, provide security to the area, they start to hopefully collaborate, learn, trust each other through relationships, and informally start to operate more like a team of teams. The challenge is, as you go up the bureaucracy, those relationships are much more, I would say, that muscle memory for how they operate is much more rigid. And so it becomes much harder to do that. And so part of the goal of the task force was to break down that mid-level and even senior level friction that was preventing us from learning and operating effectively as a group. And so that was the big change. And even for someone like myself, who, by 2005-06, I was managing, a task force in Baghdad of both Iraqis and SEALs and, other special operations components from the military. We had to then attach into other existing mechanisms. So in this case, the special mission units that McChrystal was in charge of, as well as the conventional mission units that the other special operations commander had, as well as the battle space of the respective conventional force that owned it. And we had a mandate to operate all around the country. So we would find yourself going in a different 2-star command. So I could be working for an Army general one day, and I could be working for a British general the next day. You could be working for, somebody else the next day. And so being able to seamlessly move in and out and keep things deconflicted and operating effectively so that we're all trying to achieve the same end state was sort of the goal, the objective of the larger apparatus, was to basically remove those traditional roadblocks or friction points that existed that was inhibiting productivity against the common mission set.
Gene here. I want to pause here for 2 reasons. One, I want to just marvel at the vast complexity of the organization that Dave just described. Hundreds of thousands of people under a 4-star combatant commander, overseeing forces from all branches of the U.S. military services, plus coalition forces, plus civilian leadership. I'm reminded of a CTO summit that I had the privilege of attending that was held shortly after 9/11 by DISA, the Defense Information Systems Agency, and specifically the DISA CTO at the time, Don Meyerix. It was such an impressive group. But one of the things I remember most was an org chart that Ms. Meyerix showed. She said something like, "You're from the commercial sector and you think you understand complex org structures." And then she showed a pretty typical org chart that we're all familiar with. And then she showed an org chart that was easily an order of magnitude more complex, describing so much of what Dave just described, but also included the intelligence agencies, not just from the US, but coalition forces, coalition partners, and so much more. It was really remarkable to me at the time, and hearing Dave tell the stories about how he would be reporting to so many different superiors in such a compressed time period shows just how fluidly people like Dave had to move around the organization. And secondly, I think all this is so great because it describes the conditions in which the dominant architecture may not be able to solve the mission at hand. When the problem space is so vast that no one group can see all the pieces of the puzzle. When information must be shared faster than what the official communication channels allow, because there are no official channels between the components of the systems that actually need to talk to each other. When local learnings need to spread much more quickly and broadly than what current programs allow. And all of this is made urgent and important because the adversary is learning and acting far quicker than you. All right, back to the interview.
So that was the structure. Now, we couldn't formally do a lot of this stuff, right? So if you want to say, hey, when I combine this unit, I want to like create a new unit, we didn't really have that ability to do that. So really, this was much more on the second thing you were talking about, was like the informal way that we operated. So it was more about establishing a series of values and principles that would govern how we collaborate and communicate. And in this case, we tried to demonstrate trust by giving more information, quality information into a system that otherwise we wouldn't have done, which then enabled other people to kind of get some comfort. And that sharing, connecting actually started driving, strategically and operationally where we were going much faster. And so the big aha for me was, growing up in a pretty tribal culture, used to be knowledge was power. If I knew something before my competition did, I don't mean my adversary, I mean like literally like the Army guys, I had an advantage maybe getting the mission or getting the operation, whatever else. Well, what we quickly realized, you can extrapolate that across like the CIA or State Department or whoever else. In this world, we said, hey, well, look, that's really ineffective if we're going to be successful as an enterprise, because we don't have, everybody has different pieces of the puzzle. Everybody has different authorities that allows us to operate. Everybody has different resources and tools and toys to play with. If we can figure out how to like put our parochialism aside and just focus on the outcome, more of a mission-based team, then, we can potentially be much more effective as an enterprise. Get out of our own way for like, so we really focused on those processes, those leadership principles and values that are pretty analogous to Agile. It allows teams to sort of rapidly emerge and work outside of what I would say the traditional organizational charts framework. And that's when you start to get, to me, massive speed, productivity increases. Anytime you found yourself trying to justify yourself inside of a bureaucratic framework, it was just friction that was going to slow you down, right? You said, well, this boss doesn't want you doing it because he's in charge instead of that person. You're like, well, ultimately, I don't really care who's in charge. I'll give you guys all the credit. I just want to be able to go do this. And, and as a mid-level manager at that time that has, I would say highly competent, qualified operators, that I work with, they just want to go do the job every night. And so your goal as the leader was really just to sort of like make sure there was enough stuff to do to keep them, sort of focused. Because if they weren't, then, there's nothing worse than a bored Navy SEAL. They tend to find trouble. It's sort of inherent to their nature. So there's a self-preservation aspect to myself as well in this.
Yeah. Awesome. And by the way, just to maybe expose some of my thinking, I mean, I genuinely believe that it's no surprise that the people who the story resonates most with are software people, because I think there's something very similar in the experience. So one question before I ask Jess to reflect on this is, if you were to compare the before and after McChrystal era, what were the top differences that actually made a meaningful impact into what you were trying to achieve?
To me, the biggest difference was how it felt. And so if you step back and you just went in and looked at it, what it felt like is that everybody was part of this larger team. And that regardless of where you came from before, you now self-identified with this being part of this task force. You could go to an embassy in London and you could hear an analyst talking about what they're doing, how they're contributing, and how they're part of this larger task force, because the pace and the tempo and the ability that people now were connected into that on a real-time basis allowed everybody to feel like they were part of something bigger than themselves. And some of those parochial, legacy, I would say identification markers, they were still there for sure, but you almost identified with this new transformational, group of people. And it was really magical to be a part of it. And what was also interesting is it was so diverse. It wasn't just the traditional special mission unit tier 1 people. It was also all of the other apparatus that comes around that. And potentially it started to expand, right? So what me and May started off as, primarily just a handful of like what you would call highly specialized units, all of a sudden it started to grow to conclude conventional units and to control, non-government organizations. Because the basic thesis was there is no person who has the full answer to the problem, and we need to be humble enough to look for capability or perspective that we lack in order to basically solve this problem. And the problem was so dynamic and changing that it was critical to do that. Let me give you an example. So financing was coming through banking systems. So treasury, who in my upbringing I would never have anything to do with, is now heavily engaged and involved in negotiating with foreign governments and trying to slow down the illicit movement of funds between groups that were supplying these our enemy with materials that were then having devastating effects on us. So just shows you how wide this thing became.
And what were the visible, if you were to study kind of the behaviors of upper leadership in that transformation, what were the things that you found most helpful to help create that condition that you called magic?
To me, it was sort of a recognition that they don't have the answer, right? There is no silver bullet. There is no strategic move. It was less about that. It was sort of having the vulnerability to say, I don't know, and I need your guys' help to figure it out. And if everybody starts with that premise, then all of a sudden you worry a lot less about where you fit into the system, and you just start trying to figure out how do we solve the problem most effectively. And that became sort of transformational. So the leaders that were most effective in this environment that we found after reverse engineering and studying this were people that took approach of trying to manage, we call them gardeners, people that manage an ecosystem where the main purpose was less about making decisions. It was more about removing obstacles and barriers for productivity and effectiveness. And those leaders were, almost, they were naturally more like coaches than they were bosses, because they were sitting there saying, well, I don't know, but have you thought about this? Have you thought about that? Or I'm going to connect. Hey, I heard something similar from over here. Why don't I connect you two and you guys start talking about it? So they were really just trying to make sure the ecosystem, the network, was actually working. We used to have this saying that in order to defeat a networked organization like Al Qaeda, we had to become a network ourselves. And what intuitively was check your ego and your past history aside and focus on the task at hand and try to find insight wherever it comes from.
And if I had to push you for two other sort of helpful behaviors in the before versus after, can you give me maybe two more?
Yeah, sure. So I think being self-aware is probably the most important skill set that we see in leaders today. It's the idea that if you're trying to move or affect a system of any type, understanding the energy, both catabolic and constructive, that you're putting into that scenario and how that's affecting others is really, really important. And then the other one was, there's so many, but the other probably two were connecting, which to me was you have to inspire people towards a common goal and objective and give them kind of a consistent path to kind of say, all right, to chart themselves to. And then the other part of that connecting is actually demonstrating empathy, the ability to walk in somebody else's shoes, understand their perspective. Because when you're trying to solve a challenge and people are coming at it from their own biases or backgrounds, the ability to understand that would help speed up the process by which you could actually get to constructive solutioning, vice, fixated on, whatever pain or preconceived bias that you had coming in the situation. And then the last one was just discipline, right? You have to have consistent habits and patterns so that the organization can not spend a bunch of its cognitive load trying to figure out how to show up or what to do. Because if you have those three things working in parallel, then you start to de-risk the environment for constructive criticism and feedback that allows for rapid learning that's necessary.
Gene here. I want to pause for a moment to compare and contrast some of the leadership characteristics that Dave and Jessica just talked about, both so far and later in the presentation, as well as in Dave's DevOps Enterprise presentation that we'll be playing for you in the next episode. They talk about as key leadership skills, functional excellence, ability to connect, self-awareness, discipline, decision-making, effective communications, and continually learning. I'm amazed at the overlap between this and the transformational leadership characteristics that we found in the 2017 State of DevOps research. Specifically, in that year, we asked every respondent 15 questions among 5 domains around transformational leadership. Vision. To what extent does a leader understand the grandest goals of the organization, and to what extent can they get in front of it, not just to be relevant, but to help with the achievement of the most important goals? Intellectual stimulation. To what extent can the leader challenge basic assumptions of how we do work? In other words, just because it was great 20 years ago doesn't mean that we need to be doing it today. Inspirational communication. To what extent can the leader overcome fears, generate excitement, create coalitions required to overthrow powerful ancient orders? Supportive leadership and personal recognition. What we found in the 2017 research is that the bottom third of organizations with the least amount of these characteristics were only 1/2 as likely to be high performers. Dave also just mentioned you need to create an environment where constructive criticism and feedback can enable the rapid learning that's necessary. This reminds me of the Westrom organizational typology model from Dr. Ron Westrom, which also shows up in the State of DevOps research. Specifically, Dr. Ron Westrom studied healthcare organizations, and what he found in 2004 was that those organizations with the worst patient outcomes had these characteristics. Information was hidden, messengers of bad news were shot, bridging between teams was discouraged, failures were covered up, and new ideas were crushed. Whereas in the highest performing organizations, those organizations with the best patient outcomes, information was actively sought. Messengers were trained to tell bad news. Responsibilities were shared. Bridging between teams were rewarded. Failure causes a genuine sense of inquiry, and new ideas are welcomed. In a conversation with Jeffrey Frederick, co-author of the book Agile Conversations, noted, the Western model is really about how information flows in an organization. Is information suppressed or extinguished, or is information encouraged to flow? And of course, this brings up the notion of psychological safety. At Google, in Project Aristotle, and Project Oxygen, there was a multi-year study trying to understand what made great teams great. And the top factor was always psychological safety, as measured by to what extent do people on a team feel safe to take risks, to say what they really think, without the risk of feeling insecure, embarrassed, ridiculed, or even being punished. And that factor was higher than dependability, structure and clarity, meaning of work, or impact of work. I loved revisiting this work when researching the Unicorn Project. One of my favorite treatments of this was written by Charles Duhigg in a New York Times Magazine article called What Google Learned from Its Quest to Build the Perfect Team. I'll put a link to it in the show notes. All right, back to the interview. This is so great. Jess, I just made the claim that I think the software community, probably more than most that I'm familiar with, are especially receptive to observations and lessons like this. Can you just talk about that in terms of your own background and maybe your reflections on the changes required at various levels of leadership?
Absolutely. So I would say that I guess just stepping back for a moment. So Team of Teams was a really powerful story, but it was largely an inductive analysis of one single massive culture transformation. And sort of what we realized in the process of in the process of developing Crosslead is that there's so much applicability and similarity to the way that the special operations forces were operating and the way that agile developers operate. Some of the similarities are especially eerie. So, for example, the concept of AARs in the Navy SEALs very, very closely mirrors the concept of retrospectives on agile software development teams. So in general, there's sort of this overlap in that we have a collection of cohesive team units that are operating together but have dependencies on one another that are required to succeed. So I think that part of the reason why Team of Teams resonates so much with this community is that there's an acknowledgement of the pain and the suffering that's really associated with all of those dependencies. So and Gina, I was listening to your recent episode of Idealcast where you interviewed Elizabeth Hendrickson, and she was referring to a situation where the architecture had grown so complicated that no single member of the team could hold it in their mind. And I think that is certainly an example that Team of Teams really draws out. The entire nature of the conflict was so complicated that complex that no single individual or team is capable of understanding it. And as soon as you acknowledge that fact, you've done something right for the teams. You've created a system where they really need to where they acknowledge the need to continuously coordinate with one another, learn from one another, and understand how an action here is going to have impacts there and understand how dependencies across teams are going to manifest and better understand the consequences of their actions. So I really think it's that self-organizing nature that resonates so much.
So if I were to concretize some of the things I've heard, I mean, here's what I'm hearing. I'm going to try to use the language of structure and dynamics. It sounds like one thing that is definitely clear is that the structure of the organizations didn't change drastically. Navy SEALs still reported through the Secretary of the Navy. Army Rangers still reported through the Secretary of the Army. And, there might have been some changes at the top leadership level, but in general, the configuration of the forces at a macro level did not change. And yet, what I've heard was that there are certain behaviors at the very top that help enable that sense of magic, where that began with a sense of, I don't have all the answers. There is no strategic move that can take us there. And that invited a different dynamic of working and helped accelerate this very fluid, dynamic, informal network that you assembled.
What I would say is there were definitely some structural changes that were taking place behind the scenes, right? And I would say those were operating on like 3 or 5 year cycles, like between like planning to execution to finishing, much like you would think about a reorg in a business. I don't think they really mattered though, fundamentally to like to the operations that were happening like inside of a deployment cycle. And those cycles could be 3 to 4 months, or they could be longer depending on, what team you're with and what cycle you're operating on. So there was kind of both going on. Me personally I spent time actually looking at both. When I was overseas, all I really cared about was getting the job done and being effective. And then when I came back and they said, hey, let's take a broader look at the organization, how we could think about, officer career progression or enlisted career progression and structure that's going to enable us to fight in the future. But those were part of 5-year study, procurement, decision-making cycles associated with the quadrennial defense reviews that the military apparatus operates under. But that wasn't going to have zero relevance if all of a sudden the enemy was doing this tonight and all of a sudden they were doing this tomorrow. And like, how do I reform and adapt to be able to solve this problem over here? We needed to, it was going to be woefully inadequate. And so when I think about increasingly complex environments that are changing, almost as soon as the big structure change was finished, it's already much less relevant than the initial assumptions that went into making it. And so what I see working with companies over the last 10 years or so is they go through these organizational structure changes because they're trying to find some optimal model for how they're going to be, like line block chart organized. And I'm not saying there's not value in that. I'm just saying increasingly there's less value in that, meaning the organizations that I see are naturally unhealthy are ones that are constantly reorging because it creates such fatigue in the enterprise. And then it distracts you from doing what you need to do, which is actually focusing on, producing quantifiable outcomes rapidly based on changing conditions. And so for me, we spend a lot more time at Crosslead thinking about how you work versus how you're structured. And our assumption is how you work, you'll emerge to the appropriate structure. And if that structure is relevant for a week, great. If it's relevant for 6 months, better, I guess. But my experience is it's going to change. That's the only thing I can say definitively is like it will change.
Yeah, and to add on to that too, it really goes back to the analogy that you referenced earlier between the chess master and the gardener. The chess master says, I can look at the pieces on the board, I can optimize them in a perfect way for the situation that we're in right now. And that to me is the leader or executive team who says we can solve this problem with a reorg. We can move the pieces around in the board and they will be arranged in the optimal fighting pose for the situation we face today. Whereas the gardener's approach is, I don't know exactly what I'm going to need 6 months from now. However, I know how all these parts are going to have to work together to achieve any particular goal that they set their minds on. And instead of focusing on the optimal placement of pieces, they focus on the optimal interaction between groups, which sets the conditions that they can accomplish anything that they set their minds to.
This is so great. And to even concretize this even further. So what I'm hearing is that the successful patterns relied less on that kind of reconfiguration of the chessboard. But another part of structure is what are the allowed interactions between the pieces? I just want to confirm, it sounds like before people were not motivated to let Army units speak to Navy units, speak to the intelligence agencies. The changes that did occur in that era certainly made those interfaces between those teams not only allowed, but encouraged them. You did a ton of things to actually reward people who shared information, span those boundaries. Is my understanding correct?
Yeah, it's amazing. I forget who gave the quote. Maybe it was like Mark Twain, or somebody else. But it's amazing how much you get accomplished if you're willing to not take any credit for it. And I think that was kind of the underlying principle for us that were overseas a lot. Because I will say that one of the other unique aspects of this fight was there was, we call it the away team. There was a group of people that were fighting very different wars over and over again, right? So they were gone for the better part of those 10 years. And then there was obviously these systems back home that were maybe operating on different cycles, or they were in and out. And eventually over time, you started to care a lot less about who got credit for stuff. What you really cared about was, could you accomplish the mission and could you bring your people home safely? And so then you started saying, all right, well, look, I'm happy to let you guys have X, Y, Z as long as we can get this done. And all of a sudden, then people's defenses break down and they start actually thinking about the outcome. It's this idea of there's naturally division in the system and there was constant friction. And the most effective leaders were more humble and took a more empathetic approach and just said, look, it's not about me or even this org. It's really about this outcome. And whatever it's going to take to get the best team on the field, with the best resources to accomplish the mission is all that really matters. And that we didn't start that way, right? We didn't start that way. And in order to have the credibility, you had to have a lot of success, right? You had to have a lot of continued success where people say, you know what, we're going to give these guys the benefit of the doubt. One of the interesting things when I was taking congressional delegations over to see the task force, the commander at the time was so important to him that this organization was not seen as wasting taxpayer dollars or looking like they had too many creature comforts. So everything was very Spartan. And you would walk in, you would see plywood tables and you would have nice technology in there, but you're eating meals ready to eat instead of fancy stuff. And you're not in some palace. Everything was what I would say transactional or was temporary, because that is, we're going to move somewhere else sometime. And so you come over and be like, wow, that's the room you guys sleep in. That's what you're using. What do you guys need? We need more ISR collection platforms. They're like, okay, whatever. Give these guys what they want. They're clearly not wasting money. If you went to you went down to the headquarters, you might be having a meeting in a palace, sitting at a golden linen table that used to be Saddam Hussein's. And even at that, they're operating in the same mindset. It just looked different, right? It looked like, wow, okay, these guys look kind of comfortable here, right? So if you went over there, well, these guys are clearly just, they don't care about the frills. And the impact that had on our credibility was pretty profound. I mean, it was pretty ingenious by the boss. And, you got a lot of benefit of the doubt from delegations, regardless of what party they came from or their disposition on the war or not. They said, okay, well, these guys are credible, right? Credibility equaled freedom of action, freedom of maneuver. And that was critically important to, us being successful.
Gene here. Two things. I love this metaphor of the chess master versus the gardener. The chess master sets up their position on the board as the all-knowing strategist in the center who knows all and optimizes the entire system, whereas the gardener focuses more on the interaction between their own pieces and enables the desired dynamics, which allows for far more decentralized decision-making, sense-making, and actions, which is required to defeat Al-Qaeda in Iraq, a far smaller but far nimbler adversary. This reminds me of something that Steve Spear said to me recently. He said, often when we're hired into a specific role to fulfill a certain set of responsibilities within a static system. In other words, that will be my job, not just for now, but into the future as well. Contrast this to how people were onboarded into a new role at Toyota. There was no real expectation that they were in a static system. In fact, the higher you rose within Toyota, the more you were explicitly expected to change the system. I think this wonderfully supports the chess master versus gardener metaphor that Jessica just talked about. And secondly, what Dave just said about credibility equaling freedom of action. This seems like a very important principle, so I'll just underscore it here, and this will come up in my second interview with Dave and Jessica in another episode. Okay, back to the interview. One of the things I loved about your presentation, Dave, is how you sort of divided up kind of the world into, I think it was three levels, right? Kind of executive leadership, middle managers, and frontline leaders. And something that is starting to, maybe a hypothesis that's starting to form for me is that kind of in these type of transformations, really the change that is most challenging is this middle management, which is super interesting because it alludes to the fact that we need executives to understand that there's a better way of working. But in the technology community, we have this phrase that we use a lot is the frozen middle. Can you scrutinize that claim that the challenge of team of teams ultimately is really a story about how do you kind of change the middle management?
I really see four layers, right? I see like strategic level C-suite executives and decision makers. You see people at the bottom that you're calling your doers, the people that like have to they're operationally connected to the outcome on a daily basis. They're just doing the job. Those are your frontline operators and workers. And then you've got these two levels of management that sit between them, right? You've got a mid-level manager that are usually directly controlling and leading frontline doers. And then you've got senior management that are probably managing multiple teams of mid-level managers. And my experience is that your friction point is really with the middle two, the senior and middle level management. So, and the reason why is sort of intuitive. If you think about the senior C-suite, they're what we call the good idea factory. It's usually their vision, their idea, and to be fair, it's not probably going to affect their lives too much. They're not going to really have to do much. I say that tongue in cheek, but it's just the reality is they got other things to worry about, but by driving some internal like change. And then at the lower level, you're along for the ride, right? You're doing kind of what you're told. You may not like it. You may complain, but ultimately you're going to do, what's needed, or you're going to opt out, right? You're going to go somewhere else. So then you got these two level managements that really control the actions, and mid-level management, in my opinion, are very practical, rational actors for the most part. And what I mean by that is they're dealing with daily problems that they're seeing manifesting on how their teams are operating. And they're trying to solve those problems directly. And if they see something that can help them solve a problem more effectively or maximize an opportunity more rapidly, they're more or less going to come around because it's in their own best interest to do that. So they tend to be a little more flexible, in their mindset on how they sort of adapt to learnings and changes, right? And usually the goal between those is just to get enough of them connecting and talking to each other so that the learning is not happening in silos; it's just happening across. The challenge, like we talked about structurally before, is with the senior management, in my opinion, because they don't have the same incentive. They're not necessarily dealing with frontline problems; they're seeing problems that are probably more systemic, but potentially. The problems that exist, they'll see maybe like a structural or a decision-making right as something that is personal or validating to their position or authority. And so their reluctance to change because it equals risk is much greater, right? So either they're trying to get to the next level, and if they make a big change, it doesn't work, they're going to get penalized for that. At least that's the perception. Or they're an expert in that domain, and if you change the way the system, they become less relevant, and all of a sudden, that gives them anxiety. So that to me, that's the toughest layer because it doesn't necessarily operate with the same level of solution mindset as the mid-level. It doesn't mean it can't do that. I'm just saying, like, historically, when you see problems in bureaucracies and you say, well, why are they doing that? When you put yourselves in their shoes, you're saying, oh, it's because this is scary for you. This risk is going to undermine your personal identity. And so I got to figure out how to like appease that if we're going to like get past this issue. Right. So when we put processes in place, which was basically agile principles scaled to an enterprise level, we were really trying to create communication and learning mechanisms that could hack those two layers, right? You could get frontline insights and feedback on what was happening, rapidly disseminated across mid-level managers, and not inhibited by some bureaucratic or decision-making bureaucracy that was being managed by the senior management. And then ultimately to the C-suite, it would start to affect strategy. I mean, one of my other big aha moments was being in Afghanistan. I was part of the ISAF staff, and we had a team that was solely focused on like writing the strategy and the vision. And one of these brilliant minds, kind of came in and was looking for a break. So he came into my little operations center and was like, hey, I have an idea. I was just bouncing around. And, what he was trying to do at the time was try to take, speeches or guidance that he had gotten from, in this case, the president and the National Security Council or the UN Secretary General and their council, and figure out how to like locally apply those to our strategy in Afghanistan and make sure that we were consistent with authority. And what was so obvious in the conversation was that it was just so out of sync. And what I mean by that was not we were like doing something different. It was the fact that like people in Washington, D.C. could not possibly be expected, because they were so detached from the reality of what's happening in the battlefield, to understand the dynamics of saying, how do we integrate with the Taliban? What's the best process to do that? They were just so far removed. We almost needed operations on the ground were dictating what the strategy would be, because of the rapid feedback interaction points we were having with, in this case, the local constituencies. And that needed to then go back and make sure it wasn't outside of the values or principles that were put in, the guardrails that are put in place by higher headquarters. But they were not going to be able to write a plan for, say, recidivism locally. It was just not, it wasn't possible, because things were changing so fast. And so figuring out how to like break that down, I don't know that we ever did it, by the way. I think it was, always a point of frustration and context. But having spent some time in a DC think tank and seeing some really, really, really smart people that have not a lot of operational experience trying to come up with policy back here, for things where you have a large data set, you can do that, right? I think if you say like, well, let's look at like Cold War dynamics with rational state actors that we had deep understanding with, you can come up with plans. But like for something that was as volatile and rapidly changing as a counterinsurgency, it was, to me, the operations on the ground were going to start driving what the options were from a strategic level.
By the way, it just reminds me of a story of in London in the 1600s. They were essentially planning the entire Georgian economy, right, from thousands of miles away, with no knowledge of soil conditions, water levels. Right, it sounds like a very similar problem.
Yeah, it wasn't quite that bad, but yes, I mean, it was this idea that really, like, what we found was operations started driving intelligence, right, not the other way around.
Oh, so that is very, very interesting. We are so much looking forward to the DevOps Enterprise Summit Vegas Virtual, which will now be held on October 13th to the 15th. As always, the goal of the programming committee is to bring you the best experience reports and to outprogram all our previous events. And this year, we expect to deliver on that promise again. I am so excited about the speaker lineup we have for you, partly because they are among the most senior technology and business leaders that have spoken at this conference, showing you how important the work of this community is. Maya Liebman is CIO of American Airlines, who presented at our annual forum in April, and we were fascinated by the perspectives that she shared with us. I'm so excited that she will be co-presenting with our longtime friend, Ross Clanton, about the American Airlines journey. And since 2014, we've all been dazzled by the CSG journey, as told by Scott Prue and Erica Morrison. I am so thrilled that this year, Scott Prue will be co-presenting with his boss, Ken Kennedy, Executive Vice President and President of CSG, the largest provider of customer care, billing, and order management in the US. Ken and Scott will be sharing their story on the interplay between business and technology leadership and how it resulted in their amazing accomplishments over the years. This is just the beginning. Stay tuned for more exciting announcements about our amazing speaker lineup. This will undoubtedly be the best DevOps Enterprise Summit program we've ever put together. You can find more information at events.itrevolution.com/virtual. So, Jess, can you react to that notion about senior management? I mean, it just as Dave was talking about this, I was just laughing because I think that we see so much of that. Maybe to use kind of this language, right? They really do represent the dominant architecture, and often they're put in a position where I think they're often asking, what is my role in it? And so how do you overcome, can you validate that? And how do you overcome that fear?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think Dave's point and your point on the frozen middle is very much a valuable one, because the frozen middle is the group that has to say, if there's going to be a major change ever, they're the one that has to come to terms with what got me here will not get me and my team there. So they're the ones that really have to implement a change. It's really easy for a leader to stand in front of a podium and say, we're going to deploy 10 times a day, because they have to deploy 0 times per day. So there's really no change for what they're going to have to do by making that demand or strategic change. Whereas at the more middle manager or senior manager layers of the organization, they are going to have to change. They're going to have to change what they're holding their teams accountable for. I think it's a quote by Dr. Henry Cloud. You get what you tolerate, and those are the layers that are going to either be those are the layers they're setting the standards. So if they're tolerating, deploys twice a quarter, that's what they're going to continue to get. So it's really that group that has to change their mindset. And we see the same thing a lot with agile transformation. We'll hear of an executive that has heard, oh, digital revolution. This is the way forward. We're going to pivot our business to be much more digitally focused and customer centric. And while all of those things sound really good, they don't necessarily have an immediate ramification for the executive. They have immediate ramifications for those middle managers, which is who really needs to buy in to drive the change.
And what concrete advice would you give to someone who is asking that question, a senior leader who is asking, what is my place in this new system? If teams get to define the work, define how it's done, just specifying their own work. I mean, what? And they're left with the question like, what else is there left for me to do? What do you tell them?
Right. So I mean, the two pieces of advice that I would give would be, one, focus on the vision and making the vision as crystal clear as possible. And there's some really good research from Professor Drew Carton at the Wharton School, who published a paper on how the techniques used by NASA and specifically President Kennedy to in the 1960s before the moon landing to really just establish a visual image. It's not just we're gonna pursue the new frontier of space, but we're going to land a man on the moon, and you can close your eyes and you can picture what that experience is going to be and what it's going to look like. And I think that the role of those senior leaders is to help create that mental image for the network of teams that they're responsible for of what success looks like, and make it something so crystal that they can close their eyes and that they can picture it. The second I would say is really just setting the conditions for the teams to interact and operate as fluidly as possible. So in a lot of cases, that's addition through subtraction. The senior leaders are often the ones that can remove rules. They can remove rules and barriers. They can improve funding for tools that are going to help teams work better together. So really recognizing what those opportunities are to reduce barriers that make it hard to interact across teams, and taking advantage of the leader's authority to remove those roadblocks.
Yeah, and just to build on what Jess is saying, from a mindset standpoint, because she's 100% right, I go back to servant leadership fundamentally as the mindset that you need to have in today's environment, which is it's not about you. It's really about how do you position your people to be successful. And anything you can do to remove those obstacles and barriers that Jess just talked about, whether it's like meetings or bureaucracy or pain or friction, that's really what's about. Your job is to be a steward that allows your people to be successful. And if you're doing your job well, it's really about them. And so if you're struggling with, well, why I'm giving up, you're already in the wrong frame of mindset, in my opinion. You're already thinking about yourself and what's right for you, vice what's right for your team. And in my experience is, if as a leader, your job is to take care of your people, and if you do that consistently, what you typically happens is your people shock you and surprise you of how awesome they perform, which then reflects very well on the culture that you've established as a team that it makes. And I think that's ultimately that becomes you're the glue culturally for the organization that enables to be successful. And that's the magic. Because if you take that away and you put something else in, the whole thing starts sub-optimizing. And so it's just sort of redefining the success metric and how you evaluate performance for senior management, and you change the incentive model. I mean, I think where organizations struggle, and I don't think it's specific to software engineering, but like financial services is a great example where, traditionally you get promoted because of your ability to basically manage a P&L and make tactical decisions and assume and take on risk. But increasingly, as you get bigger, if you're trying to create a sustainable organization, that should matter a lot less. Right. It's other people that have to be able to do that and do that effectively. And you're basically sitting there trying to make work. And so that's how you create a legacy. That's how you create an enduring organization that's going to be successful and resilient.
And looking back at in your military days, was there a senior leader that you think would just epitomize the change that you would wish upon other people who you're the person who felt like that and had an aha moment and started acting and behaving different ways that led to a bunch of incredible successes?
Yeah, I mean, there's tons of examples. I was very fortunate to work with just some incredible talent over the years for me personally. But the ones that always stuck out in my mind were actually those non-commissioned officers. It was these chiefs and these leading petty officers over the units that they were tactical experts at what they did, right? So they were probably better suited than most to say, no, this is the right way to do something or not. But if we were going to get any type of scale or effectiveness, they had to turn into really a mentor and a coach figure. And they had that incredible depth of experience. But when they modeled that behavior, that's when we started to see tremendous effects at a localized level on productivity, increases in productivity, because you'd have relatively junior or new people who are now being empowered because some of their senior managers, in this case, those chief petty officers or senior chiefs, those NCOs, are setting conditions for them to basically operate, more effectively as individuals. And that's when the whole thing unlocked. And my job really was to stay out of their way, right? I mean, if you're doing well as the officer, you're really just trying to say, hey, does the chief's really calling the shots on the objective anyways? That they're the ones that you got to listen to when especially when things are chaotic, and you're just trying to basically manage the whole operation and make sure that it's inside the boundaries of success. So that was my experience. It was like, I could think of a couple of individual names. I won't give them just in the interest of their own security and stability, but those leading petty officers, those chiefs that I was fortunate enough to serve with overseas, almost without question, were my heroes.
And so these are people with decades in the service, if I understand.
Yeah, I would say the average tenure for a chief petty officer is somewhere between, the earliest you can make chief, if you're screaming up the ranks, is probably 8 or 9 years. And, usually these guys are 10, 15, 20 years of operational experience at this point. And so they've forgotten more that as a junior or mid-level officer that you'll ever learn.
So this is fantastic. So maybe let's leave the domain of sort of highfalutin, theory and go into actual practices. One of the things that you've talked about a lot, Dave, was one specific thing that you had, if I remember correctly, it was like this global daily call, thousands of people on the call around the world in this very informal network. Can you talk about what that call was? What were the specific objectives, and what might distinguish a great call from a mediocre call, a productive call versus an unproductive one?
Yeah, so we called it the name of it overseas was the Ops Intelligence Update. We chronicalized it pretty specifically in the book Team of Teams. What it was fundamentally was it started off as a staff meeting between the senior commander and his immediate staff. It would take place between the forward headquarters and the rear headquarters, right? And it was basically them to stay synced and just deconflict on what was going on. It was like a daily meeting. It was probably 15 to 30 minutes, and there was probably 10 or 15 people in it. But as we started to evolve as an enterprise, what we realized pretty quickly was that at the senior level, we had these insights on what was happening because we could see across domains and start to put together a picture. And what we realized that we were fighting individual wars that we were winning locally, but on the aggregate, we were losing. And at the local level, you're running your own operating mechanisms and your own critical learnings, but you feel pretty detached from, say, a similar unit in a different geography, even in the same battle space like Iraq, or forget about if it's something like the Philippines or Northern Africa or something, right? Like you're like, well, our missions are just totally different, so there's really nothing to learn right now. And so what we saw was this gap of information change. So what we did was you said we need to start opening up this meeting to try to break down those natural bureaucratic layers in the organization and start to connect dots between them. Because the way we're disseminating information now is local unit discovers something, writes a report, it goes to a higher headquarters, it goes to another higher headquarters, it goes to another higher headquarters. It goes back to a training command, gets institutionalized into training, maybe trains a unit, and they come back over. So it was like the learning cycle was like effectively like
5 years.
Yeah, like 18 months. Yeah, it was slow. Now, locally, you were learning quick, but the cycle between units was relatively slow. Obviously, that would get accelerated if it was something catastrophic, because that you would speed up that chain. But I would say on aggregate, it was pretty slow. And even the special mission units that were on shorter rotation cycles, theirs was still probably 9 months long, right? It was still woefully inadequate. So we put this meeting in place with the main idea saying, hey, it starts from a position of humility. We don't know what we don't know. And we know that this problem is bigger than like what Jess was talking about earlier, that we can like wrap our mind around. So we just need to find a way in a disciplined, structured format to share critical updates on what's happening, and then look for patterns, right? Look for themes or concepts that are applicable, not just in one geography, but in others. And that became kind of the art to it. And so we had this mechanism every day to rapidly cross-level key insights from the night before. And that way you're disseminating those learnings by centralizing them effectively across the larger task force, so that then locally I could then say, all right, I'm going to take this thing I just heard and maybe either go do subsequent conversations offline with that group, or I think I have what I need, the context I need to make localized decisions. The other benefit was if the organization need to pivot, right? So now it's not just about a learning, but it's like we got to go from this to that for some reason. Well, in the old days, that's like moving an aircraft carrier. You're talking about like 20,000 people. You got to shift their mindset around something, and you play the telephone game of information dissemination. By the time message gets down to the lower unit, in our case, a pretty big bureaucracy spread across a lot of different time zones and geographies. All they hear is, "Yeah, we got to do the same thing we did last night." Okay, got it. Right? They're like, there's. So now all of a sudden, you had a vehicle in place because this meeting became every day for 90 minutes, and it had, thousands of people on it daily across every time zone. Now it became a mechanism where you could rapidly disseminate like not just learnings, but also intent, right?
Yeah.
And understanding, like, or like a shift in principles and values. And so it could move the organization much faster that way as well.
So I heard one more sort of aspect of structure there, which is that it almost became your participation in that meeting gave you an interface to everyone else, so that if we need to create a sub team or whatever, you could quickly kind of marshal up a group, the common interest, and actually act upon it, as opposed to waiting for it to percolate through the.
That's right. It gave you the closest thing you could get to as a mid-level leader in the organization to visibility of the entire network. You could sit there and go like, "Oh, I didn't know those guys were working on that."
Right.
And I have that same need down here. And especially when it came to interacting with the interagency, right? I mean, I had my own informal networks with my peers that were in other parts of the battle space, so I could call if I really, wanted to bounce them. But like the idea that I would go be dealing with a CIA agent who had been looking at this target set that I happened to be like just shifting onto like this night, that they've been looking at for 5 years. Like before, my access and availability to them was like, first of all, I didn't think I had authorities to do that. And two, I wouldn't know where to start to look. Now all of a sudden I can see that. And one of the things that the leadership did is they sort of gave us permission to sort of collaborate informally. And they kind of left it up to us to say, well, if you're already a part of this task force, we're going to give you the benefit of the doubt. We'll start sharing, because that behavior is being modeled above us. Mm-hmm. And so it sort of gave us the freedom of action to do it down low. And so that sort of sped things up. Because the big constraint in this whole thing was information control, right? The idea that like I don't, this is not appropriate to be disseminated to a larger polybase. I see this in companies all the time. They go, well, this is proprietary, non-public information that if it got out would be a violation of SEC compliance rules or laws, or potentially give our competition advantage. And I just. It's almost like the cure is worse than the disease then, right? Because you're like, okay, well, we're not going to tell anybody anything, but then how do they expect you to do anything? Right. So, we had a bias towards speed and transparency.
Yeah. So to pile on to that, as far as practices that we've seen that were outlined in Team of Teams that we've seen wide adoption with our clients and those that we've connected with over the years. So dozens of companies at this point are doing something really similar to the operations and intel update. Admittedly, we haven't sold anybody on a 90-minute meeting that takes place 365 days a year. But what we do see a lot of is companies that are doing a 30-minute meeting, whether it's every day, every other day, 2 days a week, where they are sharing those critical updates. And Gene, you'd asked about what specific characteristics are what the specific characteristics are of a good meeting and one that's bad, and some that we've observed specifically are one, just that as a good characteristic, it's one, the meeting creates dependency awareness. So the stakeholders go to the meeting and they learn something about how what they're working on relates to how something that somebody else is working on. The meeting forges connections between group members. So perhaps if the three of us were on a meeting and I learned that I have a dependency on Dave, who has a dependency on Gene, then the three of us can have a short sync after the more formal meeting to coordinate with one another. And then as an outcome, we see that these meetings are actually very effective in reducing other meetings, because otherwise perhaps I would have a standing meeting with Dave and a standing meeting with Gene. And what the group sync allows us to do is reduce all of those other standing meetings to one that is collaborative and shared across teams, and where we're able to just perhaps do a quick meet after on the high level things that are relevant for that particular week. As far as when we've seen these meetings go awry, I would say that the two areas are when when the meeting becomes just strictly updates that could be communicated better via some other forum, whether it's email or Slack. So if people are sitting in the meeting and they feel this could have been an email, then that's obviously a very bad sign. And then the second is when it becomes a point-to-point conversation between perhaps two of the attendees about a specific challenge or dependency that they're facing. So the role of the leader in those meetings is really to make sure that those bad things are not happening and to maximize the good things. And I would say that the sort of outcome metric that we see as, wow, this is really working well, is when you see people that are voluntarily opting into the meeting that aren't required to attend, because it becomes such a valuable source of information that by missing it, they feel like they're missing out on something that's really important and valuable.
Gene here. I love what Jessica just mentioned. She's saying that a critical job, especially for middle managers, is to be able to create concrete manifestations of the vision. In my last episode with Mike Nygaard, I talked about having just read Gene Kranz's amazing book, Failure is Not an Option. I learned that the Apollo 9 mission was actually a bit of a Hail Mary. The goal was to pull in the timeline in order to achieve President Kennedy's goal of landing a man on the moon and returning him safely back to Earth by the end of the decade. It was breathtaking to read about all the risks involved, but their philosophy was high risk, high gain. Under enormous pressure, in 1969, they eventually came up with a plan that they had sufficient confidence to achieve the mission as set forth by President Kennedy back when he was still alive, back in 1962. Jessica mentioned a paper by Dr. Andrew Carton and Dr. Brian Lucas. The paper is called How Can Leaders Overcome the Blurry Vision Bias? Identifying an Antidote to the Paradox of Vision Communication. I will put a link to this paper in the show notes. That's super interesting. And so I'm just trying to apply, just kind of create the word cloud of what's actually going on here. So I hear a lot of what you just talked about, Jess, sort of like marshaling, deconflicting, just awareness of dependencies. But something I also heard was sort of initiation of new actions, right? It's like, I just heard something. I'm going to go find some people with a common interest, and I'm going to marshal a group together that didn't exist before with a potentially creation of a new short or medium term objective. I'm actually forming a new coalition or a group. I just want to confirm my understanding there.
Yeah, absolutely. So a new group forms, and whether it's just for 15 minutes to talk about the specific thing that came up during the meeting, or it could be longer term that perhaps two teams realize that they're working on something that's really similar, and maybe there are components they could share, or maybe that there's something that they can do to mutually make each other's lives easier.
Awesome. It sounds like, and one of the things that really caught my attention was a dynamic that actually led to people actually wanting to opt in. Dave, it sounds like the old behavior was knowledge is power. I'm going to hoard it. And every piece of knowledge that I have and that you don't have, I can use to my advantage and your disadvantage. And then somehow this inverted it, that this call created a mechanism that rewarded knowledge sharing. Can you talk a little bit about that, or even validate that was a dynamic?
Yeah, that was a dynamic. I mean, the reason, to Jess's point, when you know it's going well is when you have that mid-level management layer opting in voluntarily, because you can't really at that scale force them or hold them accountable to showing up when they're opting in on their own volition. And the reason why they would do that is because there are insights that you can gather that you couldn't get anywhere else. So for us, the currency for operations was heavily correlated to certain critical assets that were in high demand, like helicopters or like collection platforms or like close air support. And so inevitably there would have to be prioritization decisions made at the operational level, right? Where they would say, hey, these are where these assets are going. You would see that in that meeting. And then you have a sense of, okay, I now know where the cards are being dealt for the night. And I can now start horse trading with local battle space commanders that have those assets to try to unlock potential latent productivity that might exist. And so we would then establish those relationships locally and start doing horse trading between them, almost like created like a marketplace where we could basically say, hey, you have this, can I borrow for this? I'll give it back to you and you get some of the credit. And they were like, okay, sure, I'll do that. And that's what really unlocked the productivity across the enterprise. Where we see them not go well is when we don't spend the time up front to understand what the interdependencies are. So when you don't have that semblance of currency and interdependencies, then it just becomes another meeting, to Jess's point, where there's a series of updates that people don't find to be necessarily relevant or not. I do think there's a lot of value sometime in some exploration that takes place between two senior leaders. As a junior leader, listening to how people think out loud around a decision that they're wrestling with was super helpful context if I was trying to figure out how to get something approved, right? Because I'd be like, oh, wow, I didn't realize that was what was top of mind for the boss. Like this thing over here in this other country is weighing on him heavily and potentially has implications on assets or resources. That's context I lacked, that if I could have walked in and said, hey, here's what I want to do. And the guy goes, well, no. And then I go, well, why? And they go, well, because there's this larger thing at play that you didn't realize. And you go, well, I could have shortened that cycle if I had some appreciation for that. Plus it had a way to help the leaders at the mid-level scale and develop. So traditionally, what the military does a good job of is they send people throughout their careers to and from education and training venues, right? So you make a rank, you go to school for 9 months to a year, then you come back, and then you order events. The next rank, you do it again and again and again. Well, if you're a high demand asset, like a special operations operator, your ability to go take time off to go to school was curtailed dramatically during this fight because there was more requirements than there were bodies. And so the learning that would take place just by hearing leaders talk and think out loud was super helpful to junior. Like I would go just for that, because I'd be like, wow, that's context I otherwise would never have gotten access to unless I was like an aide de camp or something. And so it really did a lot to professionalize the force indirectly. So you can use the same mechanism to do, one, drive your culture, two, professionalize and develop your talent, and then three, increase its overall productivity by improving the quality and the narrative of the message. Because what we find in complexity organizations is the hardest thing to do is to stay aligned. Because if things are changing, the priorities are changing, you don't know if what you're working on is productive. And there's nothing worse than like non-productive time. Like I just spent a bunch of time building something or coding something or doing something that all of a sudden isn't valued anymore. And you're like, well, gosh, that was wasteful. Like I don't like wasting my time. So if you're hearing how those priorities are shifting and there's a mechanism to do that in a much more efficiently than like that telephone game, that to me was like super helpful.
That's interesting. So what I just heard was this is not a rebellion/revolution of middle managers. This is actually a vehicle where senior leadership has a voice where they can model the desired expected behaviors and amplify that across, it must have been a breathtaking scope, right? Maybe even far beyond their official area of authority. Am I hearing that right?
Yeah, and I think there's room for potentially two different things, right? But the Keystone Forum was really a way for you to connect strategy with execution at the operational level for I would say the team. And really what you're doing is you're hacking those layers like I described earlier. Yep. But there were also informal networks that were created, almost like these liaison groups that acted almost like APIs that could connect information flow across the system. Oftentimes they would be energized, right, or accelerated based on something they heard in this Keystone Forum. They'd be like, oh, okay, well, here's a pervasive problem that this group can go spend time on. This informal network of thought leaders that are dedicating some portion of their mind share to solving larger problems for the organization, right? So that also was taking place. So we had both of those established. So you had this like basically change agent networks that existed that would then be tapping into this process that was systemic in as far as how we operated, right? And those two things together allowed you to basically pivot large organizations effectively. John Smart is writing about this in his book.
That sooner, safer, happier.
Exactly. Which he's about to release, because he did something very similar when he was driving a digital transformation at Barclays, right? He created these change agents, for lack of a better term, and then when they had a specific thing they need to go focus on, he can mobilize this informal army to basically go attack friction wherever it exists in the organization to unlock productivity.
A couple of things. It's amazing to see them referencing John Smart's upcoming book, Sooner, Safer, Happier, describe all the pioneering work he did when he led the Ways of Working team at Barclays, an organization founded in the year 1634, which actually predates the invention of paper cash. The other thing I wanted to mention here is the dynamics of having this incredibly vibrant ops intelligence call. Jessica mentioned that this was a meeting that people opted into just because it was a source of so much information that you couldn't get anywhere else. It was a way to connect with peers who are solving similar problems that you could collaborate with to better achieve your own objectives. This reminds me of the themes that show up in John Allspaw's presentations for many years. Most recently, in the DevOps Enterprise London conference, John Allspaw talks about the need to learn from incidents. He asks questions like, are your post-incident reviews being read by people outside of the team? Are they being referenced in code fixes? Do people want to attend these meetings? This reminds me of a comment that Bethany Macri said when she was also at Etsy about how the post-incident reviews, these blameless postmortems, were widely attended because it was one of the best ways to learn about areas outside of your team. In the DevOps Handbook, we quoted Randy Shaup, who over the years has been a chief architect at eBay, an engineering director at Google, and is now again a chief architect at eBay and a VP of engineering. In the DevOps Handbook, we quote him about his experiences when he was the engineering director for the Google App Engine team, describing how the documentation of postmortem meetings had tremendous value to others in the organization. Quote, as you can imagine, at Google, everything is searchable. All the postmortem documents are in a place where other Googlers can see them, and trust me, when any group has an incident that sounds something similar to that has happened before, these postmortem documents are among the first documents being read and studied. I remember having a conversation where he said, whenever there's a customer impacting at Google, everyone would be looking forward to the postmortem documents being published because everyone loves war stories. My point here is that there's a dynamic where sources of incredible insight, like the Global Ops Intelligence Call, like the post-incident reviews, are a source of incredible learning and is a way to spread knowledge across the organization. All right, back to the interview. That is fascinating. So actually, you mentioned one thing about the sort of internal marketplace. So in the book Team of Teams, one of the stories that really caught my attention was how so many missions were scrubbed at the last minute due to lack of availability of certain scarce resources. And was it like helicopter transport, intelligence gathering platforms? And so my interpretation of this was that was really kind of the inability of any centralized planning system to know everything and forecast who needed what, and how do you get a certain scarce thing to who needed it most. So I think you just talked about exactly that, which is this became almost maybe it wasn't the marketplace, but it facilitated this horse trading so that the people who needed something the most could get it and horse trade their way there. Can you talk a little bit more about that the notion that it became validated that it was really, this became a way to augment the planning processes. And it was really middle managers who were needed to get those things to where they need to go most.
Yeah, I mean, to me, this was probably the biggest single productivity driver for the enterprise, which was, there was only so much that could be managed centrally when it came to the efficiency of decisions on critical assets and infrastructure. And so in order for you to get the most productivity out of a certain system, there needed to be something much lower, much closer to the problem set, a much lower level leader managers that are basically trying to figure out how to I would say load balance, for lack of a better term, that asset, that resource to be effective locally. And then, because if you try to do it centrally at the scale that we were operating on, it just wouldn't work. There was just too many competing interests. So to me, that was, typically if you think of traditional prioritization of any drill, you've got the higher headquarters that says, okay, these assets are going to be overseas. And then then there's a combat commander that says these assets go to these two countries. And then these assets go to these three regions in the country. And then inside of there, it starts to like, okay, well, now that's about as low as we can possibly manage it. So what this allowed us to do was I had relationships with, let's say, my Delta Force counterparts over in another operating base. And because they were Delta and Delta's the best, they had all the best toys, right? And so I knew that, I had to somehow access or leverage their toys if I was going to be able to like get the most productivity out of my force. So I put my best operator physically in that person's headquarters and said, hey, you do with him what you want. He's here to basically help provide a conduit of information flow between our two organizations, where should you need any of the resources or tools that we have, he's your guy. And if you want to use them for any other stuff, unless it's something like morally and ethically wrong, like go nuts. Right. And, going back to those leadership skills, this high performer was all those things we talked about. He's a humble professional, was highly skilled, competent. He was very self-aware. Like he understood how to like walk in somebody else's shoes. He was extremely disciplined in his how. So very soon he started to build a relationship, started to establish credibility. They started using him for more and more stuff. And then when I'd say, hey, they have this collection platform tonight, can we potentially use that resource to put our things that we're looking for on this device, so it could try to find those too. Is a room. They said, yeah, we got some extra capacity here. You can do that. I said, all right, well, I know I'm not going to be able to keep it. Can you at least give me like a location, and then from there, I'll you can go back to doing whatever it was before, and then I'll assume the risk after that. And so all of a sudden, our tempo dramatically unlocked. And we were able to pick up. And it's funny. I actually remember going up to the higher headquarters to visit one of my other liaisons, and the commander of all the forces in Iraq for the Special Operations Unit. He was like, "Hey, Dave, do you guys have stuff on my assets?" And I started laughing. I was like, "Well, yes, sir." And he was like, "I don't understand." And he goes, "Well, I guess it's okay." And and it was funny because he was like, "Well, all those that increase in productivity that you're seeing from your centralized force, some of you're counting our stuff, right? We're just giving you guys the credit for targets that we're prosecuting that they don't have the time or they don't want to, but they're still like important. And let's use a software analogy, bugs. Maybe they're lower priority. We were like cleaning up some of that backlog of stuff. And so in the net productivity increase, and then, eventually as we got better and they got better, the quality started to go up, and all of a sudden, the capacity is expanding, and then the whole system's working more efficiently, more effectively. So that was the magic that sort of goes outside the traditional, like, I would say, prioritization. It was sort of like inside of the sprint cycle, in this case, the day, you had two effectively, like, think of them like engineers, like trading lessons and practices to help each other out to basically deliver on time. And that was the magic.
Gene here. This is amazing. So Dave just described in phenomenal detail one of my favorite parts of Team of Teams. This is around page 178, where they talk about liaison officers that they would send to key partners like intelligence agencies. They seem to allude that in the old days, they would send people who weren't fitting into their unit, people on their last rotation before retirement. I think the implication is that they were often sending not the highest performers into these assignments. I quote from the book, "However, as these interfaces became increasingly important, we realized the potential for bolstering our relationships with our partner agencies by sending a strong linchpin liaison officer. As it turned out, some of our best liaison officers were also some of our best leaders on the battlefield. We started taking world-class commandos and placed them, attired in civilian suits, in embassies thousands of miles from the fight because we knew we needed a great relationship with the ambassador and the other interagency leaderships posted there. Everyone hated removing some of our best operators from the battlefield, but we reaped enormous benefits. Our goal was twofold. First, we wanted to get a better sense of how the war looked from our partners' perspectives to enhance our understanding of the fight. We saw one piece of AQI up close and daily, but we knew that they were part of a larger global system of finance, weapons, and ideology about which other people knew much more than we did. Second, we hoped that if the liaisons we sent contributed real value to our partners' operations, it would lay a foundation for the trusting relationships we needed to develop between the nodes of our network." So we just heard an amazing example of this. In this case, Dave sending one of his people and embedding them in one of the Delta Force units. Right after that passage in Team of Teams is one of my favorite stories in the book. They describe how a U.S. embassy in a troubled nation finally accepted a posting of a liaison. Apparently, this officer got a very lukewarm reception, despite being, quote, a walking mass of extroverted energy, habitually upbeat and helpful. They write, "At his new post, he was initially granted no access to intelligence and given nothing to do, so Conway volunteered to take out the trash. Each afternoon, he went office to office, gathering refuse and carrying it to the dumpster. When he found out that one embassy colleague loved Chick-fil-A sandwiches, Conway arranged for the next task force delivery to include several in his contents. A man the U.S. government had spent hundreds of thousands of dollars to train as a Navy SEAL was, for 3 months, a glorified garbage man and a fast food delivery boy." So the story goes, when the situation heated up in the country's capital and the ambassador asked whether he knew anything about force protection and dealing with growing al-Qaeda threat, that person was exactly where he needed to be. "I do," he said. "That's what I'm trained in, and I can do you one better. Let me make a call." Soon, the entire weight of the task force enterprise was at the disposal of the interagency team at the embassy. Our liaison officer was there to serve the collective mission from trash to terrorism. The task force relationship with that country grew tighter nearly instantaneously. A new node in our network became online and began to thrive. I just love that story because it indicates the investment that they were willing to make in these relationships in the hopes that they would eventually pay off. I see so many examples of this in the DevOps community. Infrastructure teams embedding their best people into dev teams to help them figure out how to securely, quickly, reliably promote code into production to collectively help their organizations win in the marketplace. Okay, back to the interview.
Yeah, we see this happen a lot within product lines at manufacturing companies, within value streams of technology companies, where resources are allocated at a particular level, and then everything that's done below that is based on shared consciousness within that group of who needs what when, and how they can collectively leverage the resources that have been assigned to them, also collectively to achieve whatever their mission is. Because whoever's allocating the budget to that group doesn't know, for example, who's going to need a designer on their project and how much of a designer's time is going to need to be used, or who's going to need a GPU. They don't necessarily know those things. So getting those resources assigned centrally and then having those forums to create shared consciousness of who needs what when is a really valuable way to manage those resources effectively.
Wow, it's astonishing. I'm just sort of connecting some dots. So I have to imagine this happening at scale must be breathtaking to see, right? That creating these relationships across the scope and breadth of an entire organization, encompassing hundreds of thousands of people.
Yeah, it was pretty amazing. Like if you think about it on a task force level, just in Iraq, so not the whole task force, just Iraq. Early days, we were doing like 2 ops a month, basically. Then it got up to like 2 ops a week, and then by the end, we were doing like 10 ops a night. And so, same resources, same assets. I mean, the quality of the intelligence and some of the technology was certainly better over the years, but the same number, the physical constraint was like number of operators that could go do something. Those numbers didn't dramatically change over that time period. And then more importantly, the actual quality of the operation went up as well. So like casualties went down, success rates went up. All of those things started dramatically improve because of this. The culture sort of enabled and encouraged this level of synergy and collaboration. And then the last thing I would say is it had dramatic effects on innovation and creativity, right? So what it did was localize problems that were happening. The fact that you were cross-leveling those in real time, and it was tied to understanding strategic direction and intent, you could start to better, faster create, products, services, offerings that were aligned with where the organization was trying to go to. Oftentimes we'll see companies, invest a lot of money in like third parties to come up with strategic plans based on their deep expertise in a certain domain, and there's value there certainly. But increasingly, as things are changing, we believe that you got to emerge a solution quickly and get like real time feedback. And like back to that analogy earlier, the operations will start driving the strategy, the intelligence. And so if you have a mechanism to connect that, all of a sudden the whole org starts going faster. So what it feels like is like you just a lot of winning. Right, you're winning locally and you're winning at scale, and that is when people really start to get energized. It's funny that looking at high performing teams and culture, it's amazing how much winning will do to solve like other problems. Right, if you start having success, a lot of the other stuff that bothers you tends to go away. And so this was sort of creating some of these like micro successes, and as they added up, it started to have pretty significant effects. So if you look at any one level, you're like, oh, it's just marginally more productive. But then when you step back and you go, wow, the effect is like a 10x improvement at this scale on how things are going. And that can have decisive effects for organizations operating in competitive environments.
And is that what you mean when you say operations starts dictating strategy? In other words, people sense that there is a pattern of winning, and that that really becomes raises the question of like, how do we win more at the strategic levels? Is that what you mean?
Yeah, I mean, think of it like launching an MVP, right? So when you launch an initial product, for us, that was us going on an operation that night, right? We go on an operation night. That was our minimum viable product for the night. And we would collect information from that experience, and that would then go back into the feedback loop that would inform the next one. And so that was happening organically inside our unit. The magic of the team of teams was connecting that learning across all the other learnings that were taking place, and then trying to disseminate which of those were applicable so that you could rapidly move them across. And that's what like all of a sudden started to make us go much faster, more effectively. So that's what I'm saying. Like operations started driving intelligence or strategy, is because what we were finding on the battlefield was dictating the next target, right? We'd say, okay, we learned this, and based on this, here's the next thing that we need to go do differently to solve it, right? So it's no different than me launching an MVP, getting feedback and saying, what the consumers value the most out of this experience was this. This pace can still be optimized better. Go focus on that. You're going to get a higher return than you would on something else.
And if I hear you correctly, that pattern of winning can inform strategy or even become the strategy in the extreme.
Yeah, that was my sense, is that all of a sudden you get like that intrinsic and intrinsic motivation of feeling like you did something successful, and then seeing that success applied and scaled to a larger enterprise's outcomes and desires. All of a sudden it makes you feel connected in ways that, before you may have felt isolated, which it just improves overall morale, and if which then reinforces you want to put more time, energy, and motivation into something. And so it has this flywheel effect.
Gene here. I just want to take a moment to concretize what Dave and Jessica just said. When success at the execution level starts to influence or even drive strategy. I can totally see that happening. If you are starting to create successful outcomes by creating a dynamic of learning, what is initially an island of success will keep getting larger. If those successes can be connected with the largest and most important goals and objectives of the entire organization, I think one can quickly see how this effort would have larger and larger influence on the rest of the organization. Especially if the other parts of the organization are trapped in a culture of compliance, a culture of just following the plan. A more dynamic culture of rapid experimentation and learning will, or at least should, keep having an ever-growing impact and level of mindshare from senior leaders. As Mike Nygaard said in his first Idealcast interview, this does require that we double down on the winners, as opposed to force-feeding the losers. In other words, all too often there is this unfortunate dynamic where the projects that actually get funding are the ones that are late and losing, as opposed to the teams who are actually winning. And those are the teams we should be investing in because they have identified a potential breakthrough. Okay, I can't overstate just how grateful and amazing it has been to talk with Dave Silverman and Jessica Reif about the philosophies that went into one of my favorite books, Team of Teams, as well as hearing so many of these stories that further demonstrate the lessons in the book. So believe it or not, I only got through half of the questions I had for them, so we will be continuing this interview in another Idealcast episode. But before that, you will be hearing Dave Silverman's amazing presentation that he gave at the 2020 DevOps Enterprise Summit London virtual conference. He talks about many more of these lessons that he learned in the Team of Teams experience, which I know will resonate with anyone attempting to transform their own organizations. In the meantime, Dave, Jess, can you please tell everyone how they can reach you and problems that you'd love to work on?
You can reach us at crosslead.com. I'm jessica.reif, R-E-I-F, at crosslead.com, and that's CROSSLEAD. And Dave is david at crosslead.com. The types of problems that we enjoy working with the most are really the ones that we talked about in this episode. How do you operate more effectively as a network of teams? And how do you address some of the challenges that come with working on complex work in the context of a complex system?
Yeah, I think Jess just nailed it. I mean, we're passionate about multi-team systems, specifically how organizations communicate and make decisions in environments that necessitate flexibility and adaptability. That's always been sort of my passion. I have a bias towards high-performing organizations that are committed to continuous improvement, because I think without that, it's sort of tough. And so instilling that culture and then driving the mechanisms that reinforce those behaviors is what I think we spend most of our time with customers and clients talking about. So crosslead.com and David at crosslead.com.
Thank you both. If you enjoyed this episode, I know you'll enjoy those 2 upcoming episodes as well. See you then. Thank you so much for listening to today's episode. Up next will be Dr. Steven Spears' DevOps Enterprise Summit presentations, both from 2019 and 2020, where he talks about the need to create a rapid learning dynamic, as well as how to create them. The 2019 presentation talks about many of the case studies we talked about today, but in more detail. And in 2020, he talks about one of the most remarkable and historic examples of creating a dynamic learning organization at scale, which was in the U.S. Navy at the end of the 19th century at the confluence of 2 unprecedented changes. One was in the underlying technologies which you found in ships, and in the strategic mission that they were in service of. As usual, I'll add my reflections and reactions to those presentations. If you enjoyed today's interview with Steve, I know you'll enjoy both of those presentations as well.